Hey there, Roothaven Grounds family. Today I'm diving deep into something that completely transformed how I think about kitchen scraps and soil fertility. If you've been following along with us, you know I'm always searching for ways to close the loop in our gardens. And Bokashi fermentation might just be the most exciting discovery I've made in years. Let me be honest with you. When I first heard about Bokashi, I thought it sounded complicated and maybe a bit too out there for my simple gardening approach. But once I understood the science behind anaerobic nitrogen preservation and saw the results in my own beds, I became absolutely obsessed. This isn't just another composting method, it's a complete paradigm shift in how we can capture and preserve nutrients that typically get lost in traditional composting systems. Here's what blew my mind when I first started researching this. Traditional composting relies on oxygen-loving bacteria to break down organic matter, which means a lot of nitrogen literally escapes into the air as ammonia. You've probably smelled it yourself, that sharp, pungent odor coming from a fresh compost pile. That's nitrogen leaving your system, and it represents lost fertility that could have fed your plants. Bokashi takes the opposite approach. Instead of aerobic decomposition, we're creating an anaerobic fermentation environment, similar to what happens when you make sauerkraut or kimchi. By excluding oxygen and introducing beneficial microorganisms, we're essentially pickling our organic waste. This process locks nitrogen and other nutrients into forms that remain available for our plants, rather than volatilizing into the atmosphere. The word bokashi comes from Japanese and roughly translates to fermented organic matter. It was developed by Dr. Teruo Higa in the 1980s as part of his research into effective microorganisms, or EM. What makes this system so powerful is that these microbes don't just break things down, they actually create beneficial compounds during fermentation that improve soil biology when we eventually introduce the fermented material into our gardens. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of why this works so incredibly well. In traditional aerobic composting, thermophilic bacteria generate heat as they metabolize organic matter. This heat drives off moisture and nitrogen compounds. You're left with beautiful compost, absolutely. But you've lost a significant portion of the original nitrogen content, sometimes as much as 40 to 60%. With Bokashi fermentation, we're operating in a completely different biological realm. The anaerobic environment favors lactic acid bacteria, yeasts, and phototrophic bacteria. These organisms work at cooler temperatures and create an acidic environment that preserves rather than transforms. The pH drops to around 3.5 to 4.0 during active fermentation, which essentially puts the organic matter into a state of suspended animation. Here's the beautiful part. All that nitrogen stays locked in the material. Amino acids, proteins, and other nitrogen-rich compounds remain intact because they're not being combusted by heat-generating bacteria. When you eventually incorporate this fermented material into your soil, the indigenous soil microbes go to work breaking it down, and that nitrogen becomes available to your plants. You're essentially creating a slow-release fertilizer that's incredibly rich in bioavailable nutrients. Getting started with Bokashi is surprisingly straightforward, and I want to walk you through exactly how I set up my system. You'll need 2 airtight buckets with lids and drainage spigots at the bottom. I use 5-gallon buckets because they're the perfect size for my household, but you can scale this up or down depending on your needs. The key ingredient is Bokashi bran, which is simply a carrier material, usually wheat bran or rice bran, that's been inoculated with effective microorganisms and then dried. You can purchase this pre-made, or if you're like me and enjoy DIY projects, you can make your own by culturing EM and mixing it with bran. I'll save the detailed recipe for another post, but just know that making your own bran is entirely doable and significantly cheaper if you're planning to make Bokashi a regular practice. Here's my daily routine. I collect kitchen scraps in a container throughout the day. When it's full or at the end of the day, I chop or break the scraps into smaller pieces, nothing larger than a couple inches. Smaller pieces ferment more uniformly. I then add a layer of scraps to my Bokashi bucket, maybe 2 to 3 inches thick, and sprinkle about 2 tablespoons of Bokashi bran over the top. I press everything down firmly with a potato masher to eliminate air pockets, seal the lid tightly, and I'm done. Every few days, I drain the liquid that accumulates at the bottom through the spigot. This bokashi tea is incredibly potent. It's loaded with beneficial microbes and nutrients. I dilute it at a ratio of 1 part tea to 100 parts water, and use it to feed my plants. Undiluted, it's actually too acidic and can harm plants, but properly diluted, it's like liquid gold for your garden. This is where bokashi really shines compared to traditional composting. You can ferment virtually anything: organic cooked foods, meat, fish, bones, dairy, oils, citrus peels, onions, garlic, all the things that cause problems in regular compost piles. The anaerobic environment and acidic conditions created during fermentation prevent the putrefaction and odors that would occur with these materials in an aerobic system. I've put everything from moldy cheese to fish guts to spoiled leftovers from the back of my fridge into my bokashi buckets, and the system handles it all beautifully. There's a distinctive sweet-sour smell when you open an actively fermenting bucket, kind of like pickles or sourdough, but it's not unpleasant at all. If you're getting rotten, putrid smells, something's wrong. Usually there's too much moisture, not enough bran, or air is getting in. The only things I avoid are large amounts of liquid, which can make the system too wet and create anaerobic conditions of the wrong kind, and anything completely inorganic like plastic or metal, obviously. After about 2 weeks of filling a bucket, the fermentation process needs another 2 weeks to complete. This is why I use 2 buckets in rotation. While one is actively being filled, the other is sitting sealed and fermenting. When you open a fully fermented bucket, the material should look pretty much like it did going in, just slightly broken down and white with beneficial mold. Now here's something important. You cannot put fresh bokashi directly around actively growing plants. Remember that acidic pH I mentioned? It needs to be neutralized first. I bury my fermented material in trenches between rows, in areas where I'm planning to plant in a few weeks, or I add it to my traditional compost pile where it accelerates the entire composting process. My favorite method is trench composting in fallow beds. I dig a trench about 8 to 12 inches deep, dump in the bokashi, cover it with at least 4 inches of soil, and let it sit for 2 to 3 weeks. During this time, the soil microbes break down the fermented material, the pH neutralizes, and you're left with incredibly rich biologically active soil. I've grown some of my best tomatoes, squash, and beans in beds prepared this way. I'm not going to oversell this, but I do want to share what I've observed in my own gardens at Roothaven. Plants grown in beds amended with bokashi fermented material show noticeably more vigorous growth, deeper green foliage indicating better nitrogen availability, and what seems to be improved disease resistance. I've also noticed that my soil structure continues to improve year after year. It's becoming more crumbly, holds moisture better, and is absolutely teeming with earthworms. The nitrogen preservation aspect is real and measurable. Studies have shown that bokashi retains up to 90% of the original nitrogen content of the organic matter, compared to 40 to 60% for traditional composting. For those of us trying to build truly fertile, self-sustaining garden ecosystems, that difference is massive. Beyond the fertility benefits, there's something deeply satisfying about knowing that absolutely nothing from my kitchen goes to waste. Every scrap becomes food for my soil, which feeds my plants, which feed my family. That complete cycle feels right in a way that throwing scraps into a landfill never did. If you're ready to start your own bokashi system, begin small. Get 2 buckets, order some bokashi bran, and just start doing it. Don't overthink the process. The microorganisms are remarkably forgiving, and even if your first batch isn't perfect, you'll learn quickly. Keep records of where you bury your fermented material and how your plants respond. Experiment with different burial depths and wait times. Try the bokashi tea at different dilution rates. This is your garden, and the best practices are the ones that work for your specific soil, climate, and growing conditions. Remember, we're not just growing plants at Roothaven, we're building soil, fostering life, and creating resilient garden ecosystems. Bokashi fermentation is one of the most powerful tools I've found for achieving those goals. If this resonates with you and you want to keep learning about soil building techniques, regenerative practices, and real-world gardening wisdom, make sure you're subscribed to Roothaven Grounds. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this with your fellow gardeners who are ready to transform their kitchen scraps into black gold. Let's grow together.